It's 7 o'clock on a Monday afternoon, so you know what time it is. It's time for your weekly episode of SCV Chat. I'm your host for the evening, Moose. Before we get started, please remember the views and opinions expressed on this broadcast are not necessarily the views and opinions of the SCV, its GEC, nor any divisions, brigade, camps, or any other subsidiaries. Before we get tonight's regularly scheduled program, we do have a bit of breaking news, but I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to let the SCV National Public Affairs Officer handle it. So without further ado, Mr. Edwards, you take it from here.
Hello, everybody. Well, it's my first time on the chat, really. So, H. Edward Phillips, I'm an attorney and the National Public Affairs Officer. And you're thinking, oh, my Lord, it's another attorney. But here's the bottom line. If you will recall back in 2020 and 21, when everybody got their, everybody was in an uproar over certain objects and certain things and names that scared them and places that scared them. They decided to pass through Congress with Republican support a bill that would require name changes of military property, bases, camps, etc., that have any Confederate-related, Civil War-related names. So a naming commission was put together, and there are, if I remember correctly, 8 members of that naming commission, military brass, politicians, etc. So you can just kind of imagine. And the folks that are involved with this naming commission, their report is due to Congress by October 1st, 2022. So they've already released 2 parts of that report. Part 1 dealing with military bases, Part 2 dealing with with West Point and the Naval Academy, and also assets at Arlington. So here's the problem we're experiencing, and this report was just released, if I remember correctly, last week. So it's brand new, and it made the news nationally, but no one really paid attention to it because there are other things going on. Queen Elizabeth's death, Joe Biden being Joe Biden, and with the president. All that coverage was focused on those news stories and not focused on this. But it was an AP, story, and it was a big story, but it barely got a mention. However, the Federalist ran a good article on it, and of course, which we had prompted us to sit back once we knew the report was out to come in and release our statement. And hopefully, y'all have read it and received it through Newsflash. And it comes down to this, in my mind: we have folks who are on that commission who have an agenda based on anger, angst, hatred, whatever you want to call it. They see things in stereotypical ways. Now, one of those folks is a retired brigadier general, Ty Seidel. He's written a very critical book of Robert E. Lee. And so General Lee, for a number of American presidents, for a number of Americans, for a number of people in the military, have always looked up to him, not because he was a Confederate general, but because of his integrity and who he was as a man, as a Christian, and all the virtues he exuded. Whether you agreed with the cause for which he fought, it's not relevant. Him as a human being really outshone a number of military leaders. And he was held in high esteem by President Eisenhower, of course, even when he was a general, Patton, everybody. And even his enemies held him in high regard, which brings us to how all of this started at Arlington. So William McKinley, when he was president, he had toured the South, I want to say about 1898, if I remember correctly. And in touring the South, he visited the national battlefields. I mean, he had been an officer in the War of Northern Aggression, the war between the states, aka the Civil War. And he decided that when he went to these cemeteries, he noticed that the Confederate soldiers' graves were deteriorating and no one was taking care of them. He didn't think that was right. And he focused on reunification, reconciliation, and all those noble ideas and what had to be done to stitch the country back together again. So McKinley wanted a national monument in Arlington. Even before Congress had passed the bill and got things moving, he went ahead and said this needs to be done. Well, what they did at Arlington, which was the right thing. They disinterred all the Confederates who were scattered throughout Arlington and decided to create a Confederate section of the cemetery. And upon doing that, there was the idea that veterans would be buried there if they chose, their wives, and there were even a handful of course, they used the term Confederate civilians, but at the time of their death, that's who they were. They were Confederate civilians. They weren't American civilians. They were for the U.S. Army in enemy territory, right? So when we understand the history, we also understand that the UDC, United Daughters of Confederacy, wanted to help spearhead that with McKinley and with any other politician who would do that. Congress immediately passed legislation authorizing funds for this project, authorizing that it be placed. They wanted this memorial because it was about healing this nation and not about, a cause that some people said is a lost cause. There's mythology behind it and everything else that people are throwing at us. But it was really about reconciliation. And that was more important than anything else. And recognizing the honor with which these men and officers served. So this particular monument was designed and sculpted by Moses Ezekiel, and I cannot remember his last name, I just went blank. And he is a Jewish American, and he is also a famous sculptor of that period of time. He's probably one of the best. After the war, he served as a sergeant. I mean, he served very honorably in the Confederate Army. But after the war, he sort of became an expatriate, if you will, expat, moved to Rome and had a studio there. He spent most of his life in Rome. And then finally, on June 4th, 1914, when the monument was dedicated, all this labor that he put into it, all this work, effort, etc., Woodrow Wilson, as president, dedicates the monument. And every year at the Confederate graves, they put out a Confederate battle flag at every single, grave of a Confederate veteran. And they also, through the president's office, they put lay a wreath at the monument, this memorial. And so now what this commission has recommended is that be removed. And what's interesting is Ty Seidel, this retired brigadier general, he came in and he wanted to, really go after this monument. In his book, Robert E. Lee and Me, he really tells you on page 162, I'm almost done with the book right now. One of my friends gave it to me. So he said this, out of all the thousands of monuments dedicated to the Confederacy, this is the one that angered him the most. And it angers him because this is a bastion of, for him, the lost cause mythology among all these American soldiers who have died, through the course of our wars. And he doesn't find that satisfactory. Well, part of the problem that he has is, he sees this, sending out of Confederate battle flags. He calls them in his book today enemy flags. And he sees this war as something that, has, I guess, still continues in his mind, because he sees these, the Confederate cause, the flag, etc., the battle flag, as something that should never be allowed or permitted in Arlington. But he forgets the history of Arlington, the fact that it was owned by, Washington Custis, right? So this is the the grandson and adopted son of George and Martha Washington, and the father-in-law of General Robert E. Lee. And there's a huge connection between Arlington House and Washington. And there's a connection that will never be broken on that side, and also a connection that will never be broken with Robert E. Lee. And that's where the rubber hits the road, because quite frankly, he is angry. He tells you he's angry. He's emotional about it. I understand what he's saying in terms of, well, post Reconstruction, we had all these lynchings and everything else in the South. He's a native of Alexandria, Virginia. He also spent time in middle school and high school in Georgia. But it seems any love that he had for the South has been shattered. And it's been shattered because he's accepted a woke view of the world. And I don't know if that's in part because his wife is a finance person, originally from New York City. When she went to Washington and Lee, she was taken aback by the fact that you have Lee in repose near the sanctuary in this church, the chapel. She's Catholic, and she took it as, well, this is just sacrilegious. I'm Catholic. It never bothered me, and it's a matter of perspective and a matter of what you're willing to say offends you. And she thought they treated Lee like Christ. And so really what it comes down to, the bottom line is, he wants to destroy this vestige of what he believes is lost cause mythology in Arlington. But what he forgets is the fact that not only was this monument designed by a Jewish American sculptor, but the lead figure on top of the monument is a Southern woman supposed to represent the South. And in her hand, she has a laurel wreath made out of olive branches. And it's meant to symbolize peace, unity, forgiveness, putting everything aside. And then she has a sword in the other hand that's moved downward. And that sword, there's also a scriptural passage that says, they shall beat their swords into plowshares. And that's, these plowshares, that's exactly what this represents. It represents not a victory for the Confederacy, which Ty Sedell thinks it is, but it represents reconciliation between two sections, actually three sections of the nation. And now they want to destroy one of the very things that helped bring this country back together. And matter of fact, there were Confederate veterans who were there at the unveiling of this monument. So that's where we are. And we have to stop this, and we're going to fight it. And we have to figure out how to fight it. But quite frankly, one of the first steps is getting our face in the media and discussing this matter. It shouldn't be this way. You should never destroy something that's meant as a symbol of reconciliation and a symbol of peace between two former sides in a very horrific war. That's all I've got. Hopefully that answers what you all have read in Newsflash and gives you a little bit more background.
Well, thank you, Mr. Phillips. I hope that does answer everybody's question. We do have one question real quick, though, from our host tonight, Mr. Carl Jones. He asked, Mr. Phillips, was the naming commission found under Trump, Obama, and I'll throw one under there of or Biden?
Well, here's what I can tell you. The naming commission was constituted in 2021 in March. So post-inauguration. That probably tells you everything you need to know. And in the newsflash we sent out, there's a link to the congressional pages for both the House and for the Senate. And we're urging any patriotic American to contact their legislators and just say, look, this is not right. And we need to stop further dividing this nation. Because that's really the problem, right? It comes down to, we are further dividing this nation, and we are drawing lines that should never be drawn. We learned, that painful lesson, if you want to call it a painful lesson. But, this is dangerous. When we start taking apart memorials and cemeteries, we open up every single Confederate memorial in a cemetery and every single Confederate veteran's grave to desecration potentially. And that is problematic. And that's why we must draw the line and we must stand firm.
Well, amen. I don't think I could say it any better than that, Mr. Phillips. I would like to ask everybody, thank Mr. Phillips for coming on and talking on this subject. We might even talk to Mr. Phillips sometime after the show and discuss bringing you back to discuss this in a fuller time. We wanted to get this news out here to our members and our non-members watching the chat tonight. But without further ado, we will get back to our regularly scheduled program. Carl, as always, is going to knock it out of the park, and he's going to end today on a happy note, which I believe we all need on this Monday, especially Carl. If he wants to explain that one, I'll make him explain it. But again, Mr. Phillips, thank you for coming on. I hope to talk to you after the show and to maybe try to plan something out in the future about bringing you back on. But thank you for coming on. And before I bring Carl on, I want to thank sponsor for one of our sponsors. We have a lot now. Tonight's episode, Southern Flags and Quilts. Southern Flags and Quilts are helping us design something special for all you chat heads. Well, for the crew, but we'll get to show it off to you chat heads. Here's some of their work in recent years. They are based in Alabama. Here is just some of the great quality flags that they have. I mean, look at it. It's fantastic. They offer a great and fair price. And, of course, they're historically accurate. That's something we put a prominence on here. I mean, come on. Historically accuracy, everything. So check the link below. Go support our great friends over at Southern Flags and Quilts. Without further ado, we're going to let our tonight's host and his special guest take it away. So before we do, though, let me get a quick little commercial if I can find it. And
there is a place nestled in the rolling farmland of southern Middle Tennessee, a home constructed in 1837, nearly lost to the ravages of war. Saved by a servant and a Confederate general. A place where families loved and lost. If walls could talk, what stories could be told? If a place, a home, can feel love, loss, pain, surely this is one of those places. Historic Elm Springs and the Confederate Museum at Elm Springs. Come and discover your history.
Well, hello, everybody. I think we've built this up enough. We got a great guest on tonight. Some of y'all remember Ryan, I think, what was it, probably 2 or maybe 3 years ago? We had Ryan on and we did our Constitution Day special. And this past Saturday was Constitution Day again, September 17. And I thought we would, since there are 2 views of the Constitution, the Jeffersonian view and the Hamiltonian view, and we being Southerners, we cling to the Jeffersonian view. I thought it would be a great opportunity to have the author of this book. Let me see if I can get it in the camera. Grover Cleveland, The Last Jeffersonian President by Ryan Walters. Ryan's a good friend of mine, known him for quite a few years now, and he's one of our great historians out there. He lives in Texas, but he's from Mississippi. And how you doing tonight, buddy?
I'm doing great.
Well, I appreciate you making it up.
Yeah, I love it anytime. You know that.
How's the weather down in Texas these days?
Oh, gosh, it was so hot during the summer. We had drought, and then we got some rain, and it cooled off. And I thought, well, here's fall. But this week it's back hot as blue blazes out here.
Yeah, y'all must be sending it our way. I was enjoying the 82, 83 degree weather in Alabama, and I see it's going up into 97, 98 again this week. So I'm not happy. Hopefully y'all keep the humidity down there, though. All right, so you've written several books here over the last 4 or 5 years. Couple on the Apollo program. You got 1 or 2 out on that?
Well, I got 1 out. I'm actually starting to work on another one about.
Okay, all right. I knew there was a second one either out or in the works.
Yeah, in the works.
And then this year you came out with The Jazz Age President. Great book, by the way, on Warren Harding. And this book on one of my favorite presidents, Mr. Grover Cleveland. And I teased everybody a little bit when I was promoting this and said, why in the world would a show centered around the Southern tradition be doing, a topic on a president from New Jersey? And I'm going to ask you that question, the question leading up to the answer to that here in a little bit. But first, since you're calling him the last Jeffersonian president, what I would like to have you do, and by the way, I didn't give Ryan the questions before, so I'm just hitting him out of the blue here. But just a brief description of what is Jeffersonianism? What does that mean when we talk about Jeffersonian presidents, Jeffersonian government? What are we referring to?
And that's how I start the book out. The preface chapter is on the Jeffersonian tradition, where I talk about that. What I liken it to is the true ideals of the American Revolution. And, those really went out the window, as you mentioned, with Hamilton and Hamiltonianism. We got off on the wrong foot the first 12 years of the country. Jefferson righted that in 1800. The Revolution of 1800. You get Jefferson elected president. The Republicans sweep both houses of Congress. The Federalists are out. Not only are they out, they're out forever. Federalists, Hamilton's party, Adams' party is gone. The American people rejected that to the point they never control the House, the Senate, or the White House again. And so Jefferson comes in and begins the process of reversing everything Hamilton had done. Now, that he did do all of it? No, but it took some time for it to get all reversed. But Jefferson did a lot. He didn't get a lot of credit for it, but we're talking about limited government, decentralizations, an emphasis on states' rights, low taxes and tariffs, no national debt. I mean, Hamilton called a national debt a national blessing. Not the Jeffersonians, as Madison said, it's a national curse. So those types of strict adherence to the Constitution, not this loose interpretation, but strict adherence to the Constitution. Those types of issues, but emphasis on decentralization. Just go read Jefferson's first inaugural. That's a beautiful, really an introduction to Jeffersonian thought. And for really 60 years, up until the war, the country was Jeffersonian. As Don Livingston likens it, it's Jefferson's America. Now, after the war, it's Lincoln's America, and we're still in Lincoln's America. But Cleveland came in the 1880s and 1890s, and really you had a brief Jeffersonian interlude. He kind of broke up that radical Republican rule that had been going on since the war.
Let me go back to one thing you said. I don't mean to cut you off.
Sure.
But, you said Jefferson and the Republicans swept the presidency and Congress. Yeah. It wasn't the modern day Republicans. That was a different Republican Party. The modern day Republicans actually came. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but actually, essentially, it was a mixture of Whigs and Federalists and various other views. But the modern day Republican Party was actually birthed out of the Hamiltonian view, not the Jeffersonian view. Yep. So when you talk about Jeffersonian Republicans, you're talking about small r Republicans, not the party, the modern day Republican Party itself.
Exactly. That's a good point. Yeah. Jefferson called themselves Republicans. It's typical to call for historians to refer to them as Democratic Republicans. I don't really like that, because the Federalists call them that as a way to kind of smear them a little bit. But you're exactly right. That all folded into the Democratic Party later, because the Federalists collapsed, and you had the Jeffersonian Party was the only party, but you had two wings of it. It's kind of a little bit confusing, but they split off, and then you get the National Republicans, the Whigs, and then in 1854, the modern Republican Party, they took that name. But they're nothing like Jefferson's party. Lincoln was nothing like Jefferson's party, particularly in the radical phase later on in the war. Jefferson would have been, people try to say Lincoln and Jefferson, Lincoln was this or that, or but I hated Lincoln. There's no question about that. You see people like Mark Levin in his studio, a picture of Jefferson on one side of the studio and Lincoln on the other. And I'm like, that's how diametrically opposed can you get? They're nothing alike.
Yeah, it's Teddy Roosevelt was a great example of a modern day Republican. And I think most people would find it interesting to know, if I'm not mistaken, he's the one who coined the term progressive. Progressivism didn't start in the Democrat Party. At that time, the Democrats were still Jeffersonians, or maybe Jeffersonianism was on its way out, but it was still grounded in Jeffersonianism. The left wing ideology or philosophy actually originated in the old radical Republican Party in the modern day. And people say that the two parties swap places. I totally disagree with that. Yeah. I think the Republicans are who they've always been. The Democrats just they adopted a lot of the Republican philosophy and then took it even further to the left.
Exactly. And it started right after Cleveland left his second term. There was a fight in the Democratic Party and who gets the nomination in 1896, but William Jennings Bryan. And a lot of people say it started with Wilson. I said, no, go back to William Jennings Bryan. That's when it really started, because Cleveland and Bryan did not get along. They hated each other. They feuded with each other for the remainder of Cleveland's life. He died in 1908. But it started with William Jennings Bryan. He supported the income tax and a lot of these progressive things. So there's a great cartoon I use in my class. You can find it online, and it's William Jennings Bryan as a python or a boa constrictor, and he's swallowing up the Democratic Party, the old donkey, the old Jacksonian donkey. He's swallowing it and constricting it, and that's exactly what happened. He swallowed it up, and people realized when Bryan took control of that party that the old Democratic Jeffersonian Party was dead at that moment, and it really was.
Yeah, I think Wilson went a long way in cementing progressivism into the modern narrative. But yeah, I agree, it didn't start there. I mean, the whole left wing shift of the Democrats and of American political philosophy started before then. We just didn't know about it. People didn't realize what was coming down the road. But so talking about Cleveland, what are some things that he did that would classify him as a Jeffersonian? I mean, because we're talking, 30 years after the war, after Lincoln, 100 years essentially almost after Jefferson. And where did his he was from New Jersey, so where did his Jeffersonian philosophy come from? I mean, how does a man from New Jersey wind up being, a strict constructionist?
Well, yeah, there are a few around up there, from what I understand. He didn't say a whole lot about what, that I ever found about what caused him to believe in that, but he didn't like the Republican Party as a young man, and he was a lawyer, and he was living in Buffalo, New York with an uncle, became an attorney, and everybody in that law firm in Buffalo was a Republican, a Lincoln Republican or whatever, and he was a Democrat. He was the only Democrat in there. He didn't like the Republic. He didn't like the centralization of it. And living up there, his viewpoint of the war, he sort of had an indifferent attitude about the war, and he certainly had an indifferent attitude about slavery and abolitionism. Which you find that in a lot of cases, Northerners, abolitionists were maybe 2 or 3% of the entire population. They were not very well liked in that time period. People thought, well, slavery's who cares? I mean, you want to fight a war over it? No, nobody thought that. So he identified with Democrats. He campaigned for James Buchanan in 1856. He was too young to vote, but he out and campaigned for Buchanan as a teenager, as a young man. And that's the interesting part of a young guy that's not even 20 years old yet. He's campaigning for James Buchanan. James Buchanan is elected in 1856. And we don't get another Democratic president until Cleveland himself is elected in 1884. I mean, you get decades until you get another Democrat.
Well, you had Andrew Johnson, but they impeached him.
Yeah, and he was not elected, but
yeah, right.
Elected.
Did I lose Ryan? Moose, what happened, buddy?
Well, I think we're still live, so it might be on his end. Bless his heart. Good news is everybody's saying they're enjoying the episode.
We hadn't even got into the good questions yet, so I hope we get Ryan back.
Real quick, Carl, you might be able to answer this. You might not. Where can we get Mr. Walters' books?
I know it's available on Amazon. Anywhere good books are sold. But I know you can get it on Amazon. And look, I highly recommend. He came out with this book and the book on Warren Harding, which is called, the name of that book is The Jazz Age President, and that's a great one. Also, Harding, like Cleveland, is one of those presidents that every year these academics get together and they come out with the president's rank and order of greatness. And you'll find Lincoln always at the top. He's our greatest president ever, according to these pointy-headed whack job academics. And you'll find Harding and Cleveland somewhere near the bottom, when in reality it ought to be completely flipped around. Harding was a great president. I think Cleveland was better. I personally rate Cleveland as our second or third greatest president of all time, behind John Tyler and Thomas Jefferson, strictly because he tried to take us back to constitutional originalism, the original intent of what the founders had agreed upon and that the states had ratified. So you're back. I just did a plug for your book on Harding while you were gone. So I was telling you, Harding, he's another president that I think is wildly misrepresented, as is Cleveland, by these ridiculously stupid presidential polls that come out every year.
Link for more of his books in the chat.
There you go.
Mr. Walters, you're muted still.
How about that?
There we go. We got you now.
Cooking with gas. You're right. You look at who's doing those polls. You get hundreds of scholars doing those polls, and 80 or 90% of them are hardcore leftists.
Right.
One or two, or a handful of Republicans. They'll get Amity Shlage or somebody like that, or that's a conservative. They won't ask me. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's going to be skewed. Lincoln's number one, and FDR's right behind him, and Harding's at the bottom. Cleveland's down there. The last one I saw, Lyndon Johnson was 11th. 11th. I mean, throw it in the garden. I mean, that's.
You got to wonder where Obama's going to be, 50, 60 years from now. They'll probably have him right under Lincoln. Are you there? I think Ryan's froze up again.
Bless his heart. It's a Monday for all of us, isn't it, Carl?
Yeah.
While we're waiting on Mr. Walters, I'm going to do another one of our sponsors real quick. So hopefully he'll be back soon, because I'm loving this conversation that y'all are having. Ashamed to say, I listened to another podcast that Mr. Walters was on recently, and I didn't realize we were having the same guy on tonight. Literally until like 5 minutes before the show, before he popped in, he clicked that I was looking at buying one of his books. Like, it like I don't get like when we first started the show, I'd get like starstruck when we had these great guests. But like again, we had him on the first ever Constitutional Day episode, but like it didn't click. And so I was listening to the podcast he was on the other day, and I was like, yeah. And it podcast to dabble in Mississippi politics and try to stay up to date. And so I was hearing all his viewpoints on this, and then like again, I was thinking about the podcast before the show started, and I saw him pop up, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's the same guy I listened to the other day on the podcast, and it threw me for a loop. But real quick.
Yeah, by the way, it's Ryan Walters with a W, not Walters as I spelled it when I put that promo together. Ryan Walters, I told him it sounded like Scooby-Doo had typed it.
I haven't even noticed. I've been promoting that heavily.
Yeah, he noticed it when I shared it on my page. He said, my name is Walters, not Walters. And I said, yeah, it sounded like Scooby-Doo typed that one. The bad thing is I read that like 4 times before I uploaded it and still didn't catch
how bad I am? I'm supposed to find and check that stuff. And I looked at it and I was like, yep, that's okay. Post that 3 or 4 times on the page and share it out to 1,000 people. But real quick, one of our sponsors for tonight, 1175 Firearms Training. I wonder who could own that place. They are sponsoring the Moose Fact of the Week. The Moose Fact of the Week has been changed. I'm going to kill Connor. The average male moose is around 840 to 1,500 pounds. Excuse me, I'm going to let y'all get back into y'all's great conversation now that we've done one of our sponsorships, and I'm going to go kill one of my best friends.
The whole Moose Facts thing was created by Connor Bond for the sole purpose of humiliating moose. Okay, so all right, we got you back. So here's the big question. Everybody's wondering, why do we have a president from New Jersey as the topic of tonight's episode of SCV Chat, which is about Southern history. And we're talking about a president from the North, not quite the deep North in his day, but certainly in our day it is. All right, so you have a chapter in your book called Grover Cleveland and the South. Can you tell us a little bit about how Grover Cleveland's presidency relates to the South?
Right. Well, that's exactly right. I did a long chapter on that and looked at his relationship with the South. And going back to what Mr. Phillips said and sort of reconciliation and with McKinley and things, in my opinion, Grover Cleveland did more than anybody to reconcile the two regions, North and South, more than anything. And a lot of people recognize that. He came in not only as a Jeffersonian and that kind of thing, but he came in and said, I want to bring the South back into the Union where they belong as an equal partner. And he began to name prominent Southerners, ex-Confederates, to the government in high positions. And one of them was Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar from Mississippi, was a cabinet officer. And there had only been one Southerner in the cabinet, and that was a result of the compromise with Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877. But he came in and said, we gotta, put that past us and go forward. And people say, well, what's the big deal about Lamar? Lamar wrote Mississippi's secession ordinance in the convention. He served in the Confederate Army. He went on diplomatic missions for Jefferson Davis. So he was a very, very prominent Confederate to bring into the cabinet as Secretary of the Interior. And then in 1888, Cleveland appointed him to the Supreme Court. He served on the Supreme Court. Position to him for that reason and for his views. But later on, a lot of the same senators that opposed him realized, and one of them he wrote in their memoirs, I made a mistake. He became a very good justice on the Supreme Court. He named a guy from Arkansas who'd been a Confederate general as Attorney General, traveled to the South, went to different places. And so he did a lot to do that. Even his inaugural address, one guy wrote in a national magazine, a national journal at the time, about him reunifying the country, Cleveland. We needed that. We needed that Jeffersonian president to come back in and give the South their fair shake on things. to sort of start bringing the country back together and say it was the Spanish-American War, and they totally leave out what Cleveland had done. And you know what? The Earth didn't end. The moon didn't fall when all these things happened. That helped to bring the South back into the country. So he's an important president. He gets left out. The other part of that is his Jeffersonian views were exactly what the South believed in. I mean, this is since 1880. From 1880 to 1920, the South voted Democrat in every single election, no matter who. Now think about this. Now, who wanted to reunify the country and put it back together? The South or the North? The North was the one stirring it up with their bloody shirt tactics and that kind of thing, and keeping it going and keeping hostilities going. It was the South who was trying to come back and be a part of the Union with everybody else. They were not doing that. Example I like to give to my students is the election of 1880. After Reconstruction, the first election where the South it's not occupied by troops. The Democratic Party nominates Winfield Scott Hancock to be their nominee. The hero of the Battle of Gettysburg, where the South, probably lost the war. And what does the South do? Every single state votes for Hancock for president. So you tell me which section of the country was trying to be unified and which section was not. And when Cleveland came along, they tried the same bloody shirt tactics with him. But I said, well, Jefferson Davis is still alive. I wonder if he had anything to say about it. I didn't find any letters that he had written, but a friend of his wrote about Cleveland and said, this is our guy. He's from New York, but we can like this guy. He's old hickory come back. So we can deal with him. So everybody supported him, liked him, thought he was one of them. And he really was in a lot of ways. I think before the war, they would have called him a doughface like Buchanan or Pierce. He was that kind of a guy.
Yeah. And I think, touching on something you said there, one of the big misconceptions today is that the radical agenda to tear Southern history down, people assume today it comes out of the modern Democrat Party, and it does, but really the roots of that can be traced completely back to the Republican Party of the 1800s, and specifically the radical abolitionist movement. And, that's what was dividing the country then. Mm-hmm. And probably what Cleveland was trying to overcome. There was still some of that lingering in various states.
Yeah, no doubt.
And, we needed, we had, and again, it was I think it was like today, it was a very minor, very small percentage of people who just happened to be louder than everybody else.
Right.
The same thing is happening now.
Yeah. You're exactly right. He did not like that radical Republican. He thought the true ideals of the American Revolution came out of Jeffersonianism, and Cleveland admired Jefferson and those ideals, and he thought that was the true country. That was the true America, not this radical stuff that they're trying to do. The old Union, Lincoln saved the Union. We say he didn't really save the Union. He destroyed one and replaced it with another one.
Right.
The National Union. Cleveland's point was, let's try to put that old Union back together. And he tried, over 2 terms. And what I get into in the book, the Panic of 1893 was so horrendous. That's really what destroyed Jeffersonianism, in my opinion. He didn't have anything to do with it. Democrats didn't have anything to do with it. Jeffersonians didn't do it, but they were there when it hit, and people blamed. It really kicked them out of power for really forever.
What caused that panic?
The same thing we're doing now, inflation.
Right.
One economist called it the silver panic, because we were purchasing silver at a rapid pace and we were paying for it by paper dollars. And Cleveland came in and said, we got to stop this inflation, because this is before the Federal Reserve. This is when Congress decided what the currency was and how much was in circulation. The way it was supposed to be.
Right.
Not some central bankers. And he stopped the inflation. He stopped the silver purchases. They repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. And began to cut tariffs and do what he always did, cut spending and taxes and things like that. The economy was back growing again by the third year of his presidency. But that depression was so bad. And it was the Republicans that were in between Cleveland's two terms. As everybody knows, he's the only president with two non-consecutive terms. He lost to Benjamin Harrison. The Republicans came back in, and they just went ballistic when he came back. They were making up for lost time. And they were spending and inflation and all this kind of stuff, and it just blew the economy up by the time Cleveland came back in. Of course, he got the blame for it. But that's interesting when you look at it. You talk about progressivism. This is a time when ideas were already starting to be formed that looked a lot like the New Deal later. I mean, there were ideas, hey, we got to do something. This is a really bad depression. We need to spend a bunch of money and inject a lot of currency into the economy. Yeah. And public works programs and pay people with paper money. And it's a forerunner to the New Deal. But of course, Cleveland said, no, we're not doing any of that.
Harding, who you wrote the other book on this year, took essentially the same approach as Cleveland. I think Coolidge followed up with that. And the result was a depression that lasted about 18 months?
Yeah.
And
exactly.
The boom of the 1920s, which till this day, Republicans and Democrats alike blame on the free market, not on the government, but in fact, it was the government that caused it.
Yeah. Yeah. They say that the boom caused the bust. And I've been in a lot of arguments with historians and scholars. I've been on some vicious fights on Twitter about that kind of thing. And I think you're not even looking at what the Federal Reserve was doing with the money in 1929. Everybody knows the Federal Reserve, if you got any brains at all, the Federal Reserve caused that as much as they caused anything. But they can't do that, so they got to go blame Harding, and they got to go blame. It's conservatives that get the blame. I know Brian McClanahan did a really good show on Heather Cox Richardson here a few months ago. I don't remember which episode, but how she wrote some silly article how the economy always does better with Democrats. She's talking about modern Democrats. The economy's booming under Biden, and that's kind of. And I'm, she goes back and she's looking at all this, and I thought, that they believe stuff. The opposite is the truth, but it's a way to attack free market conservatism, free market principles. That's
yeah. I was at the grocery store today, and I've noticed that a pound of ham that I used to buy for $3.99 is now $7.99. That's our booming economy for you.
Yeah, yeah. It's the inflation's booming. That's the only thing's booming.
Moose has popped up. I think we got to go to a break. I can't hear him.
It would help if he unmuted his mic. We have our last sponsor for the night. Of course, our past Commander-in-Chief, Larry McClooney Jr. He has written these 3 great books in defense of General Beauregard. Oh, no, my bad. In General Beauregard's defense. A great book defending General Beauregard. Much like a lot of our heroes today, General Beauregard, even back when he was alive, was heavily criticized. So our past Commander-in-Chief uses this book to defend General Beauregard and lays it out almost like a court case inside a book. A very fascinating read. One of my favorites. Always love a good history book. Onward to Vicksburg. One of the first books I got when I got into college, and probably the last real history book I bought since I got into college. All the money has to go to fake history books. And then, of course, the Yazoo Pass Expedition. One of the only books written about the Yazoo Pass Expedition, so it's definitely one to pick up. Please remember that the link is in the chat to go get one of the CIC's books. You can also find Mr. Walter's link in the chat, so you can go find one of his books. Now, we will be back to our regularly scheduled program after this quick commercial break.
I am Rabbi Thomas Fortenberry. I'm a descendant of Isaac Fortenberry, a Confederate veteran. Many of the people in my family were veterans. As a military veteran, I served with the United States Army. It's important to veterans of all wars to remember those who have passed and what they did, and what they suffered, Everyone who serves gives a part of themselves. The SCV is much a part of that. The SCV serves people, not only the people that are involved as members, but the community. My commitment to the SCV is a commitment to our heritage, our cause, not in a violent way nor an aggressive way, simply in the way we live. Live what you believe, but in your defense, know in what you're defending, and defend it truthfully. May Yahovah bless you and keep you. May Yahovah lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace and blessing.
All right. So let me go. There was one other thing I wanted to bring up about Cleveland regarding the South, and I think our listeners will find this interesting. I know I did. I didn't know this. I've read a little bit about Cleveland. I know Tom DiLorenzo did an article on him back on Lou Rockwell probably 20 years ago when my awakening had sort of initialized. But one of the things I did not know, you mentioned that he took a tour of the South. Is that right? Ryan, have you froze up again? Moose, I think Ryan's frozen again.
Bless his heart.
Dadgum, you would think that Texas internet would be a little bit more updated than Alabama internet. Or Mississippi. You know what we say over in Alabama, right? Thank God for Mississippi.
I mean, what? Sorry.
I said, you know what we say over in Alabama, right? Thank God for Mississippi.
What? Why?
Every time the education polls come out.
You're saying that to a man that is going to make his career in public education in Mississippi.
Hey, you know what? You know how much credence I give those education polls? Goose egg, zero, zilch. I will send my kid to any public school in rural Mississippi above the greatest school in New York any damn day of the week.
Thank you, sir. You'll be keeping me financed and hopefully a house. I want to thank Thomas Franklin for sending in some stars tonight. But without further ado, our guest is back, so I'm going to butt out again.
All right, Ron. So what I was asking, I believe you mentioned in your book that Cleveland, in his agenda to reconcile with the South, did he not take a tour of the South?
Yeah.
And he was offered to tour a particular part of the South, which he declined. Can you tell us about those two things?
Yeah, he went down into the and because I decided to look into all of this and just to see what there. I mean, I knew about his affection to the South, and nobody really ever looked at that specific issue. And I said, well, let me just see what's there, and what was his feelings toward the South, what were Southerners' feelings towards him, and that kind of thing. And so he went down to Atlanta. I mean, he went to a lot of different places. In one of the people.
Bless his heart.
I can't finish his sentence.
Let's see if we got any questions in the chat real quick. All right, here's one that might take up some time for you. You might be able to answer it. Thomas Franklin asked, for everybody in the chat, can you explain Jeffersonianism?
Yeah, Ryan actually, we did that, Thomas, at the beginning of the show, but essentially Jeffersonianism is a view of the Union as originally formed by the states. In other words, it is the original intent of the framers, which means a strong emphasis on state sovereignty. we set up I think Jefferson said it best. The states forming the American Union are not bound by unlimited submission to their general government. They formed a constitution and reserved all undelegated powers to themselves. That would be Jeffersonianism. So I was just answering a question while you were gone, Ryan. So pick up where you left off. He took a tour of the South. Have we lost him again? He was back briefly.
Bless his heart. I know his pain so well.
Oh, there he is. All right. All right.
I am in Fort Worth, Texas. You would think that things would work. I mean, I know where you guys are.
I'm in Swipeout, Alabama.
I mean, you got like the best in the. I mean, I'm looking at mine. There's nothing wrong, nothing going on. But
yeah,
I think maybe the FBI is listening to. They're chopping it up, or I don't know. Maybe they're after me. I don't know.
All right, so Cleveland was
touring the South.
You were looking into his popularity in the South.
Nobody looked at that. None of these biographers are. And there's actually a new biography of Cleveland coming out tomorrow. I'm gonna have to run to the bookstore and see if it's there. I think he was a speechwriter for Obama or something. So this is probably going to be a disaster. But he went down in the South. He toured different parts of the South. He actually visited with the widow of James K. Polk. There was talk about maybe sitting down with Jefferson Davis. That meeting never took place, but Cleveland had said he would not have refused an invitation down with Jefferson Davis. I think of that. Who would have done that? He went to a lot of different Atlanta, to Booker T. Washington, discriminating people. Now, I know one thing you mentioned, I guess this is what you're talking about. One of the things he refused to do, he would not meet with the Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Veteran Organization. He would not meet with them. That was the Veterans Organization of the Union Army. And they were the ones with so much of the viciousness. And one of the things that he said about that was this. He said the group's objectives are partisan, unjust, and selfish. He wouldn't meet with them. He met with Confederates. He met with Confederate groups and things like that, but he would not meet with the Union Army.
Didn't he also refuse to take a tour of Lincoln's home?
Yeah, exactly right. He wouldn't go to Springfield and tour Lincoln's home. I didn't know a lot that he said about Lincoln, but I got the opinion he didn't like Lincoln, and he didn't like what had happened with the country. I think Cleveland understood all these things that we're talking about, how much the Union and the country changed. Cleveland understood every bit of that. Yeah, and we got to put it back like it was, the old American Union, the old American Republic, the federal union that we had. And I think that's what he was trying to do. And of course, they did the same thing to him that they do to anybody else that tries to do that. They'll run you out of town. So, yeah. But people realize what happened after I think his popularity was so bad in his second term because of the Depression. But within a one term of McKinley and the Republicans, people starting to ask, hey, would you consider a third term and maybe bringing back in 1900 or 1904? I talk in the book about Theodore Roosevelt seemed to be worried that Cleveland might come back again in 1904 and run again. Even in 1908, the year he died, they were talking about bringing Cleveland back because they realized what had happened and what had happened to the party, and that Jeffersonianism was dying. And somebody even said the old party's dead. So they were trying to revive it the best way they could. And of course, they ended up with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was once a conservative. He wrote an article in 1897 praising Cleveland, but of course he became a progressive because that was the trend. You know, he was a consummate politician. So, yeah,
and Cleveland running a third term. I mean, back then that wouldn't have been an issue because the Roosevelt Amendment had not been adopted yet, right. So there was no term limits on the presidency. Kind of segueing a little bit, because you mentioned the economic issues. You'd mentioned, I think you got a chapter in your book actually dedicated to this, that, you know, was was Cleveland was he doing the things that he did politically and economically as a payoff to big business, or was he truly a man of the people? And
Right.
what do your studies tell us about that? Moose, he froze up again, buddy.
Bless his heart. Usually I'm the one that has to deal with this, and if I could give him, if I could switch places with him in a heartbeat, I would, because y'all are having such a fantastic.
Hey,
Yes,
Ryan's from Mississippi. He may just need to move back home and get better internet connection.
I could move out in the woods and get better reception than I'm getting.
So, all right, what I was asking was, he was accused at the time, or it was implied at the time, that he was really a politician in favor of a big business.
Right.
But what do your studies tell us
Yeah.
on that?
I didn't find that to be credible at all. That's not certainly what the way the people saw it and thought about him. If you read establishment scholars, liberal scholars, that's what they say. Businessman's president. You see it all the time. That's not the way I see it at all. And one of these days, I'm going to write a full biography of Cleveland. I've got probably 400 pages of that. One of these days, I'll get it published, and I'm going to call it man of the people, because that's not true. I mean, the policies he was presenting were for all the people. He was trying to come up with an economic policy that benefited everybody. Everybody could benefit the same in the economy, not for the businessman. But of course, these people say, well, he was for the gold standard. Well, whoop-de-doo, we should all be for the. Look what happens when we get off the gold standard. I mean, we see it today. This is what it is. So, I mean, how does it help poor people to not have a sound dollar? That was his position. He said, if a working man goes to work, I want him to know that the day's wages he has is going to be sound money and sound wages, low taxes and things like that. So, not a businessman's president at all. I call him a man of the people. And I think he clearly was. Common people loved him. People, just common everyday Americans, said, he's one of us. He came from, he didn't come from privilege, or he didn't go to Harvard and things like that. He's a man of the people, and he's trying to do something for everybody. And I think that's the way people saw him. And that's certainly the way I saw him when I looked at the evidence. But again, the scholars, when you look at the scholars, look at where they're coming from, and you understand why they're saying what they're saying.
Right. There's an agenda there. It's like another of your peers, I should say, told me years ago. You've got these quote unquote historians who arrive at a conclusion, and then they go out and find the facts that supports their preconceived conclusion. Yeah. And unfortunately, most books today, and probably starting in the 1980s, 1990s, it was shifting in that direction. That's what you're going to get, and they're not limited to one side. I mean, it's both of them. I mean, Mr. Phillips talking about Ty Sedgley, however you pronounce his name. I mean, if that guy's a historian, I'm a freaking brain surgeon. I mean, and I'm not a brain surgeon. So,
he's not. I mean, these guys have an agenda. They're not historians. They cherry pick evidence is what they do. They go out and they do 2 or 3 little things. They take it out of context and they say, "See, look at this," and it's really not history. It's a joke.
I think it was Claude Wilson who coined the term referring to these people as Yankee mythologists, and that's essentially what it is, and it passes as history. Cleveland, and I think this is very important because especially, and I think you'll agree with me on this, we may have even discussed this privately before. It's my opinion that post-World War II, in the World War II era and moving forward, and you could even go back and say World War I, but especially World War II, the philosophy of the country shifted to some degree or another in terms of militarism and national defense. And Woodrow Wilson coined the term, I believe, world's policeman. making the world safe, making the world safe for democracy. And by World War II, I think we had adopted that as a conservative view, when in reality, you go back and read Jefferson and Patrick Henry and Madison and St. George Tucker and various others. Washington dedicated approximately 1/3 of his farewell address in 1796 against militarism and against intervening in the affairs of other countries. But today, we look at a strong military and a presence around the world militarily as conservative. Well, it's the exact opposite. Yeah. What were Cleveland's views of that, and how does that tie into the Jeffersonian philosophy?
He had a very Jeffersonian foreign policy, and I think the best example is Cuba. They were already saber rattling over Cuba during his second term to take Cuba, to invade Cuba. I mean, you even had the Roosevelts and Henry Cabot Lodges of the world, of the country, wanting to invade Cuba. And there were things going on in Cuba when Cleveland was in his second term. His second term was 1893 to 1897. And he had a meeting with the members of Congress, and they came in and they were really wanting to go down there, that the Cuban Revolution had started and there was an independence movement down there. Hey, we need to get down there in Cuba. And Cleveland flat refused to do it. He said, we're not invading Cuba. We're not spending a bunch of money and getting a bunch of people killed over Cuba. And a couple of members of Congress said, well, we decide war as members of Congress, and we'll just simply declare war on Cuba. And he said, if you declare war on Cuba, I'm the commander in chief, and I'm not going to mobilize the army and send them down there. So he put a stop to that. The other thing is, look at what he did with Hawaii. I love what he did with Hawaii. He did his best to restore Hawaii to their native rule, because we were involved during the Harrison administration, in between Cleveland's terms, with trying to take Hawaii, and to overthrow the Queen out there, Queen Liliuokalani. And she was overthrown. There was American presence there, a military presence there. We already had Pearl Harbor. We had military presence, and we had a treaty with Hawaii, a trade treaty and a military treaty. But we were involved in that revolution and overthrowing her. And Cleveland came in and said, we're not annexing Hawaii. You can forget it. And he did not allow Hawaii to be annexed, and tried his best to restore the native monarchy. He was not able to do it. It was a case of the toothpaste being out of the tube, I think. It's hard to get it back in. But there was no annexation of Hawaii or an invasion of Cuba while he was president. And of course, when McKinley comes in, guess what happens? You get all that stuff. We get the Philippines, and we take the bite out of imperialism for the first time. So it really changed with that. So he had a very Jeffersonian outlook on foreign policy. Now, he believed in having a strong military for our national defense. He kind of mobilized against the British. The British were trying to worm their way into Venezuela. So he was big on maintaining the Monroe Doctrine in the hemisphere, but not any more than that. And again, as I said, he was not in favor of a war over Cuba or anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, a strong defense is common sense. I mean, sure, we all want a strong defense, but going around and intervening in the Middle East and Europe and various other places, the case can be made that that's the opposite of strong. The more enemies you have, the less likely you are to have problems, and we seem to create more enemies. But I think Ron and Donnie actually, and Kennedy in their book, I think the name of I got it sitting on my nightstand, but Yankee Empire. Oh, there's Ron. He's going to fix me right here.
Excellent,
all right.
Excellent.
But I couldn't remember if they had written this in their book or if this was a conversation I had with the two of them. But if I'm not mistaken, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but many of the same people who had been involved with overthrowing the South had actually empowered themselves in Hawaii. And Hawaii was a repeat of Reconstruction, quote unquote, of the South. What it really was a violent takeover of a sovereign territory, a sovereign country.
Exactly. And when you look at the fact that as soon as that revolution happened, we already happened to have a treaty of annexation ready to go. We already had the plan. Somebody just pulled it out of a drawer, within a few days. It was ready to go to the Senate. And I thought, how do you draw it up that fast? Because they already had it. It was already a plan. And they're exactly right. When you look at Lincoln was an imperialist in a lot of ways. Imperialism didn't start with the Spanish-American War like these establishment historians say. It started right there. When you look at the definitions of imperialism, what they did to the South, what they did to the Confederacy is imperialism. And then they just continued on, and with Philippines and World War I and everything, and the foreign policy that we have now and military-industrial complex. It all started then. It didn't start with McKinley and Roosevelt.
Yeah, and the Jeffersonian, think about it. Here's something that I've maintained for quite a while, and it's just something that hit me when I was studying early 1900s history one time. But the creation of the National Guard was a takeover of the state militias, and prior to that happening, the states would have had a say-so and where you're sending our boys to. So,
which is how it was designed.
Yeah, exactly. So in the Jeffersonian tradition, we could have said, no, look, we're going to protect what's ours. We're not going to have anybody coming over here telling us you're going to do this, this, and this. But we're likewise, and I think John Quincy Adams actually said, Americans don't go abroad seeking for monsters to destroy. But post, TR and Woodrow Wilson, as we moved into what became the progressive era, which I maintain has never ended, going around the world and seeking monsters to destroy and taking over countries and calling this patriotism, it's become the norm, and nothing could be further from the truth. It's, if we want to take back real America, you've got to instill Jeffersonianism. Well, now, would it be your opinion that Cleveland was the last president maybe that tried to do this?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have pointed to Harding and Coolidge, and I like Harding and Coolidge. I mean, I wrote a book on Harding, but they still had a little bit of that Hamiltonian economic policy with tariffs and things like that. But they were certainly conservative in a lot of ways. I mean, cutting the taxes and spending and those kind of things. But Cleveland embodied all of Jefferson's tradition. I mean, I called him the Thomas Jefferson of the late 19th century because he and Jefferson mirror each other so well. And that's why I call him the last Jeffersonian president. He was the last president to exhibit all of the traits of Jeffersonianism, all the principles of Jeffersonianism. We haven't seen one like that. Yeah. And I hope maybe one day we will, but I don't know. I mean, conservatives today are not Jeffersonian at all. I mean,
no, not at all.
The modern Republican Party is Brian McClanahan says, the truth is the Democratic Party has gone so far to the left, they're embracing National Socialists, and the Republicans are the same old radical Republicans, and conservatives and Jeffersonians don't have a party. And that's true. I mean, there's some good people in the Republican. I mean, Rand Paul or Thomas Massey or people like that, but they're just a handful. I've said myself, I bet the whole population of this country, there's 10% Jeffersonian, I think would be a heck of a stretch.
If we're lucky. Well, folks, we've gone over a little bit, and I'm going to end it right here. I would say that one of the biggest things I've taken from the Cleveland presidency is it doesn't matter who you elect. You've got 4 to 8 more years, and then we go right back to business as usual. And I think that's what the Cleveland and the Trump presidencies and the Coolidge and the Harding presidencies proved. But let me end it right here. Ron, I really appreciate you being on. Always good talking to you, buddy. And, would love to have you back sometime real soon. In the meantime, y'all, let me find my camera. I don't know my left from my right, but here's Ryan's book. You can get it on Amazon, and I highly recommend it. Thanks again. Moose, take us away, buddy.
Well, let's all thank Carl for a great episode and thank Mr. Walters for coming on. Very interesting talking points. And, of course, as always, I'm going to have to add another book or multiple books. I was already looking at one of your books without knowing that you were the author that we're having coming on to buy. So I'm guessing I'm going to have to buy a couple more of your books now to add to my ever-growing, after I get out of college, library that I want to start reading again. So again, Mr. Walters' link has been posted in the chat. Please go and check out his library via Amazon. And of course, please just Google his name and look up a couple more of his other places to buy the book. Amazon was just one of the quickest places I found. Make sure, sir.
In the Abbeville Institute, that's who published it. So give them a look too. Yeah.
Yes, please go support via the Abbeville Institute. I always love to go read or listen to their podcast and read what they are publishing. Great group of men over there, and always have something good to say. Please remember, we have Look Around the Confederation Thursday at 7 p.m. Confederate Standard Time. Make sure to share this episode out with everybody so we can get this great episode out there. And let me see. I don't know if we have anything else I need to tell anybody. Yes, I do not. So I'm going to take poor Carl out of there. He went to go use the bathroom, bless his heart. But without any further ado, I want to thank everybody for watching. Make sure to tune in Thursday for Look Around the Confederation. You'll see me there again. We hope to have Mr. Walters back as soon as possible. He still holds the record, I think, for one of our highest rated episodes here on the chat. So let's give him a big round of applause. Thank him for coming on, and please go support him via the Abbeville Institute. And I guess without further ado, I'm going to hit you guys with a quick little self-promotion for the chat. And remember, more information will be coming out about the 100th episode of SCV Chat very shortly. Thank you.